Well, good morning, everybody. This is Barry Jones with SP History, and we are continuing our FBI series, and we've been working our way through a series of questions. And these are the questions. I've listed them here on this slide. The first question that we have been seeking to answer is how did the CIA get away with a domestic operation, which resulted in the assassination of JFK? And it is my contention that the reason the CIA got away with a domestic operation is because its agenda aligned with the FBI's agenda, which is of course, the FBI's agenda was a direct reflection of the FBI director's agenda, which was to root out communists or radicals or people who were perceived as soft on communism and civil rights leaders. Those were the two targets, communists and civil rights leaders. And if you look at ZR Rifle, its its target was somebody whom the deep state had labeled as soft on communism, somebody who couldn't be trusted in the Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. It seemed like he always gave in. So he became, in their view, a national security threat. And that was not just the view of the CIA, that was the view of the FBI as well, which was actively involved through its COINTEL programs, trying to root out national security threats, whom it considered to be either communists or civil rights of the civil rights varieties. So they shared the same agenda. And there's no way when you study the assassination of JFK that you can differentiate between the CIA's foreknowledge and the FBI's foreknowledge. They were hand in glove working together, one covering for the other. Because remember, it's against the law for CIA to operate domestically. And there's no way all the lead up before 63 that the CIA could have operated domestically unless it had the cooperation and implied consent of the FBI because they shared the same agenda. That's what happened. And then afterwards, the FBI completely covered up. And we've been going through all the evidence and stuff. So I think the answer to one, at least it's my contention, is that they shared the same agenda. And so they worked together. Question two is how did Hoover's personal ambitions, his politics, and his connections contribute to the FBI's institutional motives to want to immunize the plot or the plotters in Dallas? Well, his ambitions were all about power. And JFK and his brother Bobby stood in the way of that power. They were always trying to early retire or retire Hoover. And they were going after the mob. And of course, the FBI director had direct connections with the mob. Didn't he want to admit that there was a mob? So he certainly didn't want the Justice Department going after the mob. So for a variety of reasons, of course, the Hoover's politics were extreme far right, anti-communist, anti-civil rights. As far as he was concerned, Kennedy's were on the other side of that. And then all his connections. I already mentioned the mob. But he had connections with all these sweet 8F figures, these big business types down in Texas, which put him in the realm of some of the highest ranking politicos as well, such as LBJ, such as Richard Nixon. And so, and they were all, if you look at them, each one separately, but then put them all together, they all had their own individual motives against the Kennedys. I mean, LBJ, it was a matter of self-preservation, becoming president. Nixon, they were his rivals. They were the ones that always stood in his way of becoming president. In 1960, he ran against JFK. In 1968, he would have run against RFK. And of course, they both belonged to Suite AF. All of them were at the Murchison Party meeting on November 21st, 1963, the night before the assassination in Dallas. They were all part of the same cabal. And so of course, we've learned that, when you're in charge of the FBI, you create it basically out of whole cloth, right? You create it from nothing and then you run it for the next 50 years or whatever. The FBI is going to be a direct reflection of you. And so whatever his personal ambitions were, whatever his personal politics were, whatever his personal connections were, they were going to greatly influence, from an institutional standpoint, the body, the FBI, the agency that he ran. it's inevitable. You see it every day. Third question, are there any indications that the FBI had foreknowledge? We'll touch on a little bit more foreknowledge today, but we've already hit all kinds of uh, situations, scenarios where the FBI clearly had foreknowledge, either through informants, through wiretaps, uh, through reported conversations with folks that later that seem to be in the know. Uh, and it's proved by the fact that Hoover himself authored a memo in 1960 that someone was trying to use Lee Harvey Oswald's birth certificate, his identity, in Dallas while he was in Russia. So he knew of the patsy that was being set up 3 years before the event. And then there's several FBI telexes where word was sent out. Uh, the information was set out of a threat, an impending threat. One was in Chicago. They hurried up and destroyed that telex. Then there was one about a threat in Miami. And then there was one about a threat in Dallas. And of course, all those telexes disappeared. There's plenty of evidence of foreknowledge. And then the next question is, how did the FBI control the narrative out of Dallas? Well, they were the ones who set the narrative. It was Hoover who came out and in a phone call to Bobby minutes, just moments after the assassination, was already blaming it on a lone gunman named Lee Harvey Oswald. And then the next day, within 24 hours, he put out a memo. And of course, that becomes the talking points for LBJ coming out of the White House Situation Room. And then they take all the evidence out of Dallas and take it to Washington, including the body, including the car, everything. And they run the entire investigation with the narrative already having been set by the director of the FBI. So that's how they controlled the narrative. They set the narrative. The next question is, how did the FBI control the investigation after Dallas? And that's kind of where we're at now. We're in the thick of that. We're also looking at how the FBI handled evidence in the case. We're going to be taking a further look at that. You're going to see case after case of evidence manipulation, evidence destruction, evidence suppression, evidence alteration, evidence manufacturing or creating evidence out of thin air, with intimidating witnesses, and up to and including even we'll tell the Jack Ruby story today and how that was handled. Just all kinds of evidence that the FBI used its investigative power and its jurisdiction to forward the incriminating evidence against Oswald, preserving this lone gunman narrative, to the Warren Commission while withholding or destroying or suppressing, whatever, the exculpatory evidence that would point in a different direction. So the Warren Commission only got one kind of evidence ultimately. Another question that we're going to be getting into now is, how are the FBI loose ends dealt with? Because there are going to be some loose ends that could potentially blow up this whole narrative, and they're going to have to be dealt with. And another question is, what payoffs were only possible with FBI complicity in the conspiracy? Somebody's going to get it paid off here. Someone's going to be rewarded. Someone who had motive to steer the FBI in this direction of pursuing Lee Harvey Oswald, the exclusion of anything else, is going to get paid off. And of course, right at the top is going to be Hoover, right? He runs the thing. He runs the FBI. He makes these kind of decisions. And ultimately, his last question we're going to look at, and that won't be today, but we'll get into it eventually. How did the FBI begin losing control of the narrative? Because that will happen at some point. So those are the questions we're looking at. And today, where I want to start is with foreknowledge, and specifically with regard to this story that happened on the day of the assassination, just a couple hours after the assassination, actually. So we're on November 22, 1963, the day of the event. The event has happened, and now we're talking about the direct aftermath. Lieutenant Jack Rebel, who was a Dallas police officer. This guy is a notable person in this whole case for a couple of reasons. Number one, it was his list that seeded Lee Harvey Oswald's name into the aftermath, to the investigation within 14 minutes of the shooting. Yeah, it was his job to go find out from the Texas School Book Depository building, the authorities there, the bosses, the managers, probably human resources, to get a list of all the employees in the building. Then they were going to do a roll call once they brought back everybody from the street, the front steps, everything back into the building. They're going to do a roll call, and if there was anybody missing, those are going to be the people first on the list of suspects. And so he did. He went in, and he was ordered to do this. So he went into the building. They did a roll call of everyone who was supposed to be at work that day and who was still there. And of course, there were some people that were missing. And so then it was his job to take that list and go back to the police station, to headquarters, and compile a list of the people that were not suspects, and compile and cross-check it with a list of the people who would be suspects and put them at the top of the list. And that's where the Dallas police would start. All right. So he hops in his car. He's got a list of all the names that has been handed to him that should be there by HR. Then he's got a list of the people that he took down, their names that were there. He's going to go back and cross-check it. According to a story that didn't come out until the late 70s during the House Select Committee hearings, a military intelligence officer jumped into the car with him. An ONI officer jumped into the police car with him, and together they rode down to the police headquarters. And on the way, this ONI officer allegedly, according to a conversation that he had with another military officer at a base nearby, there had been a separate conversation where these two military officers communicated one with each other, and they seeded the name Harvey Lee Oswald into this list that was going to be given to Jack Revel. And you look at Jack Revel's list after he produced it, within 14 minutes of the assassination, at the very top of the list of suspects, Harvey Lee Oswald, there was, of course, the name is written incorrectly, and it had an incorrect address on it. So we know that information did not come from human resources at the Texas School Book Depository, but all of the information about Lee Harvey Oswald at HR Texas School Book Depository had him listed as Lee Harvey Oswald, and they had his correct address. This misapplied name and incorrect address came from military intelligence files, and they didn't have his newest address, and they had, of course, misapplied his name. So the fact that his name is written exactly as it came from military intelligence tells you where the name came from. It came from this ONI officer who was in the car with him, who himself got it from another military intelligence officer on a base nearby, who went through his files and gave him the name and gave him the alias. It's the first time they even knew that this Harvey Lee Oswald had a potential alias, Alec Heidel. This all comes seeded through military intelligence into the Dallas Police Department through Lieutenant Jack Revel. Lieutenant Jack Revel, the reason I'm telling you the story is because in this next story that I'm going to tell you, it's pretty obvious that it didn't come from Lieutenant Jack Revel. It didn't come from him, even though it's his list that the Dallas police used to go after their top suspect, which was according to his list, it was Harvey Lee Oswald, not Lee Harvey Oswald. It was Harvey Lee Oswald. But you'll see here in a minute why this story makes sense and why it's important to add context. So anyway, it's 3 hours after the assassination, and he's in the basement parking garage of City Hall. And he's walking along, and he gets accosted by FBI Special Agent James Hosty, whom you remember is the guy who was assigned to monitor Lee Harvey Oswald, his wife, Marina. He'd made several trips to Ruth Payne's house to interview Marina. He was on the lookout for Lee, found out where his workplace was. According to Fannie Lee Hamer, there was there was a altercation at the FBI building where Lee came in with a note threatening Hosty to leave his wife alone, or he's going to blow up the building, et cetera, et cetera. This is the same James Hosty. Okay, this guy constantly inserts himself into this whole story. So Hosty says to Lieutenant Jack Revel, Jack, a communist killed President Kennedy. Revel says, what? Hosty says, Lee Oswald killed President Kennedy. Revel says, who is Lee Oswald? Right there. That's key. Who is Lee? Revel, not 3 hours earlier, less than 3 hours earlier, had produced a list which had had a name at the top as the top suspect because he was not in the building afterwards and he was supposed to be. And the name that he had put up there was Harvey Lee Oswald with the incorrect address, the misapplied name and the incorrect address. It had made such a big impression on Lieutenant Jack Revel that 3 hours later, when he's confronted with the same name, he didn't know who he is. It reminds me, and this is where I always tell my students, it's the difference between studying for a test and cheating. When you study for a test, none of the material surprises you. You have familiarity with it because you've been studying it. When you cheat and you're just writing down something that somebody else gave you or information that you have hidden away somewhere, whatever, you don't have familiarity with it. It doesn't mean anything to you. It's just words. You're just regurgitating words. You're copying. It's the difference between writing something and copying something. When you write something, it came from your own mind, your own heart, whatever, and every word is meaningful. You remember it. It has significance to you, personal significance, and it no doubt left an impression. Well, in this case, it no doubt left no impression because he has no idea who this Lee Oswald is. All he did was copy down something that he was handed by this O&I officer sitting in the passenger seat of his car. It didn't make an impression on him. So when he's confronted with the name Lee Oswald, Revel says, who is Lee Oswald? And he's the guy responsible for the list that the Dallas police went on to go chase down their suspect. But it left no impression on him. So that's the first thing. The second thing, Hosty says, well, he is in our communist file. We knew he was here in Dallas. We had information that this man was capable of committing the assassination. This is an FBI officer who has been tailing. He's been on the tail. You know, first there was an FBI officer in New Orleans, John Quigley, who followed him around. And because we all know Oswald was an FBI informant. So he would, as a matter of routine, have to report to these FBI officers wherever he was. In New Orleans, it was John Quigley. In Dallas, it was James Hosty. So he knew who this guy was, and he's saying this to Revel. He's in our communist file. We knew he was here in Dallas. Of course he did. He went to his house, right? He found out where his address where he worked, and then he found out where his rooming house was, et cetera, et cetera. We had information that this man was capable of committing the assassination. Well, this is an incredibly incriminating statement. When Lieutenant Jack Revel reports this to his bosses, this incriminates the FBI either one way or the other. It shows either they had foreknowledge or it shows that they were incredibly negligent. And once this works its way up to Hoover as an official statement from the FBI denies that the Hosty ever made these statements. I mean, they came out right away denying it. And because it's so incriminating. And of course, by denying it, they're essentially calling Revel a liar. So they, after he heard what the FBI said, that this conversation never took place, Revel said, this was right in the newspaper, and I've got an arrow pointing to it. You can read it for yourself, but it says, quote, he was excited. Revel's talking about Hosty. Everyone was excited. And he probably said some things he shouldn't have. My statement will stand. If it boils down to a swearing match, I had one of my men with me who can confirm what Hosty said. They can believe me if they want to or not. If they don't, I am on record. And so evidently, uh, again, going to my foreknowledge, I believe, of course, that the FBI was aware, Hosty was aware, because we've already seen him making 2 or 3 trips out to Ruth Payne's house, interviewing Marina several times, interviewing Ruth Payne, looking up, investigating Ruth Payne and her husband, Michael, why they would be taking in the Oswald family, looking up Oswald's work address and where his rooming house was. The altercation between, it was clear that Oswald knew Hosty because he went in and threatened him, allegedly, at the FBI office and left him a note that, according to the FBI, was a threatening note. I have my own theories on that, but it's clear that the FBI had foreknowledge. And in a moment of weakness or carelessness, whatever you want to call it, Hosty basically let the cat out of the bag. And so then Hoover had to do a cleanup operation afterwards and deny the conversation ever took place. All right. Uh, Another interesting scenario that points to Bobby Kennedy having suspicion about the FBI and Hoover in particular is that in the hours at the assassination, Bobby Kennedy, there was this fear that the Kennedys, plural, were being threatened. I mean, we've already heard through wiretaps that these mafiosos were more upset with Bobby than they were Jack, and that both of them were going to get it. So in the aftermath, there was a fear that Bobby was next. And so Bobby, in an effort to protect himself, but more so his family, went and special requested the Fairfax County Police and Chief U.S. Marshal Jim McShane, whom he trusted, to protect himself and his family at their home in Hickory Hills. And the question has always been why Bobby, in the direct aftermath of his brother's death, why didn't he ask or trust the FBI or the Secret Service to protect him and his family? But Bobby clearly went around these 2 agencies, one of which whose sole responsibility is to provide protection, and the other of which is the chief law enforcement agency in our country, domestically. And he went around them and he went through local people and a U.S. Marshal to provide protection for himself and his family. I think that says a lot. In fact, if you really want to get down to it, Bobby's actions in the direct aftermath of the JFK assassination say a lot about whom he suspected. Of course, he was the Attorney General. There was no one more high ranking as far as law enforcement in America than Bobby. So he knew a lot of the behind the scenes uh, things, the way things worked, and who might be suspects, etc. He knew a lot of the stuff that had been going on behind the scenes that the rest of us didn't know. And he immediately, you look at Bobby Kennedy's actions in the direct aftermath of the assassination. He went after 3 targets. He called the CIA, ordered the CIA director, the new one, to come to Hickory Hills and meet with him, and basically confronted him with his suspicion that the CIA was behind it. He ordered his private investigator to go to Chicago, Dallas, other places, and start investigating the mob. And then he made a phone call down to Miami because he suspected the Cubans. And wouldn't you know it, in subsequent years, as the investigation started to unwind, all 3 of those groups were involved. And he nailed it within minutes. He knew already which direction he was going. And then when it came time to provide protection for himself and his family, he steered around the Secret Service and the FBI. That is not a coincidence. And that is not something to just chalk up to, well, he was in shock and he was overwrought with grief and he didn't know what he was doing. No, he knew very well what he was doing. And it's a breadcrumb that we should pay attention to. All right. I told you we'd talk about some evidence manipulation. And so we're going to tell the story of the Katzenjammer Bar. If you go downtown New Orleans, it's no longer there, but it sat pretty much right behind the old Newman building, which also is no longer there. It's been replaced by a square, which is adjacent to Lafayette Square there, and there's a new government building there in a vast array of government buildings, which is sort of what that whole area is full of. But there used to be a bar called the Katzenjammer Bar. And whether it was next door or behind the Newman building, I'm not completely sure. I just know it was adjacent to it. Uh, and of course, we've already told the story of the Newman building, what was going on in there. Guy Bannister pretty much ran the building. He had a front entrance and a back entrance. The front entrance outletted onto a Lafayette Street. There's a back entrance that was on another street, and those entrances went to two different sort of operations. Remember, the front entrance was Lee Harvey Oswald's entrance to the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. The back entrance was the entrance to Guy Bannister's detective agency, which was really just cover for his Operation Mongoose operations. He and David Ferry and Clay Shaw and all these folks operating out of the back of the building. Well, he had hired a guy named Jack Martin, who would be the private eye who would handle any of the private eye business that came in. Not very much came in that summer, according to Jack Martin, but he was always there because he was an employee. And of course, Delphine Roberts was there because she was having an affair with Guy Bannister. She was his mistress. She was also his secretary. So that's how Delphine Roberts, Guy Bannister, and Jack Martin came to know one another. They're all working together. Well, on the night of the assassination, according to Delphine Roberts, they went to Katzenjammer Bar next door and they were watching, as everybody was, the coverage of what was going on in Dallas. And of course, all the talk was about the assassination. And in their case, they had some personal connections to the players in Dallas because Lee Harvey Oswald had been in their building all summer as, of course, Guy Bannister was his handler, and he was there all summer, part-time working with the Operation Mongoose, training the anti-Castro rebels out on Lake Pontchartrain with David Ferry. And then sometimes he's going downtown leafleting, pretending to be pro-Castro. And in the evenings, he's doing his medical Manhattan stuff with David Ferry and Judith Ferry, etc. I mean, he's a busy guy, but he was operating out of this building. Of course, he had a cover job too, which was about half a block away at the Riley Coffee building. So he would come in the morning and report to Riley Coffee, go out the back door and disappear for the day, go to the Newman building and get his assignment each day from Guy Bannister. So Delphine Roberts knew who Oswald was. Jack Martin knew who Oswald was. And of course, Guy Bannister. And now on the news, their guy Oswald has been arrested for the assassination of JFK. So they're all talking about it naturally. Martin, according to Roberts, leaves the bar first to return to the office. So it leaves Delphine and Guy Bannister by themselves at the Katzenjammer. A few minutes later, a little bit longer than that, she says about 30, 35 minutes, they left Katzenjammer and they also returned to the Newman building. And when they got there, according to Delphine Roberts, Guy Bannister caught Jack Martin going through his files. Remember, Guy Bannister was former FBI. He'd been trained by J. Edgar Hoover. Nobody had a filing system like Hoover. And Bannister copied him, and he had all these files in his office, and they were top secret. No one was allowed access to them. Here's Martin going through the files. According to Delphine Roberts, Martin was trying to get or find Lee Harvey Oswald's file. I guess he figured, this is some primo information considering who he was and what had just happened to him. So he's trying to find Oswald's file. He gets interrupted. Bannister comes in and sees what's going on, and he takes his pistol out and he pistol whips Martin, almost beats him to death, right inside the Newman building. So he ends up in the hospital, and because it's an assault, a crime, he's a victim of a crime, New Orleans PD showed up to take a statement. So this is kind of an interesting story how this event almost busted open the JFK assassination and all the plot. Despite all the best laid plans at the CIA and FBI, etc., an event like this, it reminds me of when Roscoe White got mad and killed Tippit and how it screwed up their plan after the assassination. And they started making it up as they went, started making mistakes. Well, here again, we have a temper tantrum that almost screws up all their plans. He pistol whips Jack Martin. Jack Martin ends up in the hospital talking to these investigators and telling them this story because he's ticked. He's mad. He can't believe you know, his boss tried to beat him to death like this. So what he tells the investigators is, and this information eventually makes it up to the DA, who was Jim Garrison. He tells them that Bannister and Ferry had been involved in the JFK assassination. Of course, that's current news, right? It just happened earlier that day. And of course, he's telling him this on the 22nd, the night of, and the next day on the 23rd. So he's saying, yeah, my boss, whom I observed because I worked in his building all summer, was involved in the JFK assassination. And another guy who worked there, David Ferry, was also involved. And he said, and they said, well, how was Ferry involved? Well, Ferry went to Texas the day before the assassination to Houston, and he was going to be Oswald's getaway pilot. This is all according to Jack Martin. And he confirms the fact that there were that the Newman building was really just a front for the CIA's Operation Mongoose. Bannister was in charge. The money guy was Clay Shaw. Ferry was one of his key guys, as was Lee Harvey Oswald. And they asked if Ferry and Oswald knew each other. He said, yeah, they knew each other going back to when Lee Harvey Oswald was a kid. He served in the Civil Air Patrol. Ferry was his captain. So it was like a little family. He says they all knew each other. I was the interloper. I was the outsider. Nobody knew me. Guy Bannister knew me, but Ferry didn't know me. Oswald didn't know me. But I just sat there waiting for work and just watched them running around all the time. And they're in and out with Cubans. They're bringing in guns, taking out guns. One day, Oswald's going down a leaflet down at the Canal Street as a pro-Castro guy. He always got his orders from Guy Bannister. Guy Bannister was his handler. And he's telling us stories. This is a fantastic story about this all this operation that's been going on in this building right under their noses this whole time. And the guy being held in Dallas for the alleged assassination of JFK was there all summer. And now, because Martin wanted to get information, was trying to steal the file, he almost lost his life over it. So clearly something happened in that building. It needs to be investigated. We'll come back to that story. Also on that same day, actually on the 23rd, Julianne Mercer she went in and told the Dallas Sheriff's Office that on November 22nd, and she went and told Dallas Sheriff on the 22nd, and then they funneled her to the FBI on the 23rd. So on 2 consecutive days, she's talking to law enforcement about a story or about something that happened that she witnessed that, if they had taken seriously, might have prevented what came next. Anyway, the story was that she was waiting in traffic in Dealey Plaza on the day before the assassination. So this is on the 21st when this happens. She's in Dealey Plaza and traffic is ground to a halt. She's literally on Elm Street waiting to go onto the overpass, but traffic is backed up clear to the Stebbins Freeway and no one's moving. And she said, when traffic is stopped, you sit there and you're just looking around, waiting for traffic to go again. And she had time to observe something that was happening directly next to her. It was a truck that was parked up on the Elm Street curb there, literally on the curb. So it was half on the curb, half off. And it was partially blocking the lane, which is next to the curb. And she thought that was the reason for the backup. It turned out it wasn't, but he was parked there. And so it obviously stood out to her. And she said, quote, a white male, and this is a copy of her statement here, so you can read it for yourself. I blew it up. She said, a white male in his late 20s or early 30s wearing a plaid shirt got out of the truck that was parked on the curb, and he carried a rifle up the grassy embankment toward the wooden fence there. And she's watching this. And she said that the man in the plaid shirt that got out, when they showed her pictures, she said the man was Jack Ruby. So what she's saying is the day before the assassination, Jack Ruby pulled his truck up, parked it half on the curb, half on the street, got out, and he was wearing a plaid shirt, and he took a gun up the embankment toward the wooden fence. And when she saw his face, she recognized it as Jack Ruby, and she identified it. Now, this was allegedly, this happened the day after the assassination and the day before Ruby shot Oswald. Okay, so I'm getting my dates messed up here. Apologize for that. She says that on the day of the assassination, or the day after the assassination, she is reporting this to Dallas police, and then she ends up reporting it also to the FBI. But she observed it on the 21st. So this happened before. But she didn't really have cause to go in and tell this story to anybody until the assassination happened. So that's why she went in after the day of the assassination and then the day after to report on something she saw the day before. I hope that makes sense. I probably butchered that explanation, but so everything happened on the 21st, the 22nd, the 23rd. The 21st, the day before, she sees this thing, Jack Ruby taking the gun up the embankment. The 22nd, after the assassination, she goes in and reports it. And it says, hey, I don't know if this means anything, but there was a guy with a gun, blah, blah, blah. 23rd, she goes into the FBI and tells them the same story. And when she's asked to identify and looks at pictures, she picks out Jack Ruby, which is interesting. This is the before the 24th when Jack Ruby kills Oswald, right? In 1968, she resumes her life, right? And in 68, she is presented with her alleged statements to the Warren Commission, which she hasn't even read, right? She had no cause to read it. She didn't really care. She just resumed her life, moved on, forgot about everything. And then somebody comes to her and presents her testimony. Says, is this really what you saw? Because this is what the Warren Commission said that you saw, that you said. And she looks at it and she says, well, quote, these have all been altered. They have me saying just the opposite of what I really told them. He, talk about Ruby, was only a few feet from me. How could I not recognize Jack Ruby when I saw him shoot Oswald on TV? See that notarized signature? That's not my signature either. So what she's saying is, and I don't know if she identified Ruby to the Dallas police and to the FBI before he shot Oswald, or if after that she told the Warren Commission that she knew who it was because she recognized him from that day on the knoll. I don't know the sequence of that, but what she's saying is that the Warren Commission is saying the opposite of what she's saying, that she couldn't identify Ruby, and then that there's a signature under the affidavit saying that she saw this, but she couldn't identify who it was. She's saying clearly I knew who it was. When I saw him shoot Oswald on TV, I said that's the same man I saw on the knoll with the gun. And so when she was called to testify for the Warren Commission, which eventually she was, she repeated the story, and by this time she could identify Ruby and said that's the same guy that shot Oswald. But they altered the testimony. And of course, all these statements to the Warren Commission come funneled to the FBI. So this evidence gets altered and changed so as to exclude Ruby from this scenario that happened on the 21st. And of course, it brings up all sorts of possibilities, right? When you hear this story from Julianne Mercer about a gun on the grassy knoll, that's what the FBI and the Warren Commission would like to avoid, any mention of a gun on the grassy knoll. And of course, another thing they'd like to avoid is that there was some sort of conspiracy involving Ruby. They already have their man Oswald. They don't need a second man. That is by definition a conspiracy. So they're very motivated to change her testimony to say that she did not know or could not recognize or identify who it was, and therefore there's no conspiracy. And she even mentioned herself, she thought maybe it was Secret Service or something on the 21st, and she sort of just gave him the benefit of the doubt that the Secret Service was trying to prepare for the motorcade the next day, whatever. So she wasn't suspicious. She just noted it. She noticed it. And then after Ruby shot Oswald, all of a sudden her radar went off. She'd told the story about what she saw, but now she's very suspicious because it's the same guy. Ruby, the same guy she saw, now just shot the alleged assassin. So she tells Warren Commission that, and they change her testimony. They alter it. And when this researcher begins retracing the steps, they find that the Warren Commission took what the Dallas Sheriff's Office and the FBI sent them. Of course, we know that the Warren Commission didn't do any independent research or investigation of its own. They just took whatever the FBI gave them. And according to the sworn affidavits, they both said that Mercer said she could not identify Ruby, when of course she did identify Ruby. And that's huge. Okay, that shows that right away, evidence is being manipulated, in this case, completely altered or reversed, changed, so to say the opposite. And then, of course, the Warren Commission is going to just, remember I said garbage in, garbage out? They're taking this altered evidence and putting it in their report, and it's bogus. It's completely opposite what she said. That same day, on the 23rd, the CIA, and I told you this was going to happen, they're going to drop this part of the cover story to pile on and make Oswald look even guiltier. So they provide these recordings to the FBI of somebody they claim is Oswald in Mexico City between September 27 and October 2. And according to their interpretation of those events, he was in Mexico City plotting assassination and his subsequent getaway. He was recorded, whoever this voice was, speaking in Russian, but it was very broken, with Cuban and Soviet officials. And of course, we've already heard the Richard Nagel story and how they concocted or forged a letter of him saying that he just went to this embassy and he'd spoke with Kostin, which was Kostikov, the Soviet KGB agent who specialized in assassinations. This is what the CIA is dropping, which is supposed to corroborate that letter that they sent to the Russian embassy a few days prior. They're supposed to corroborate each other. The problem is the real Oswald spoke fluent Russian. In fact, according to Marina, when she first met him in Minsk, Russia, he spoke so she looked at him and she realized he wasn't Russian, but he spoke Russian so well it confused her. He speaks Russian as well as I do, and I'm a native, so he didn't speak broken Russian at all. And the other problem was that after Oswald was arrested, he was interrogated for 10, 11, 12 hours, and the FBI was involved in the interrogation. And when they compared, after these officers who had been sitting in the interrogation, speaking directly with Oswald, and then they listened to these CIA recordings provided them by the agency, they all agreed unanimously that is not Oswald's voice. So you have two problems. The alleged Oswald in Mexico City is speaking in broken Russian. The real Oswald speaks very fluent Russian. The other one is that the FBI interrogators said that's not the same voice. And so when asked later by the Warren Commission to provide to them the same recordings that they provided to the FBI, the CIA claimed that the tapes had been routinely destroyed and they only had typed transcripts remaining. So once the FBI was wise to the fact that this is not a recording of Oswald, this is not what the CIA is purporting it to be, they got rid of the recordings and they only kept the transcripts. But of course they did, right? It doesn't end there. The CIA had these embassies all wired up with cameras and stuff so that anybody that comes in and out of the Cuban or Soviet embassies in Mexico City, this is routine. everywhere, you get your picture taken. And this is the picture of the guy they said was claiming to be Lee Harvey Oswald, Mexico City. And they provided as a description, basically, what looked to them to be a 35-year-old man, about 6 feet, athletic build, a receding hairline, and a balding top. And the real Oswald, whom they had in custody, was 24, 5'10", skinny as a rail, 165 pounds, and light brown wavy hair. Now, you can just look at that picture, and as a layman, you can look at it and say, that's not Oswald. But this is who the CIA said. So the CIA tells the FBI, is dropping this as further evidence that Oswald not only committed the crime, but he was premeditating it, he was planning it in advance, and he's meeting with these Soviet officials. This guy that was an expert in assassinations, Comrade Kostikov. And then he was meeting with Cuban officials trying to arrange a travel visa so that afterwards he could escape to Cuba. Remember, this is all false flag. To be blamed on Cuba, that's where the assassin's going to end up, so that we can justify an invasion of Cuba. That's the whole point of this. So they're trying to kill two birds with one stone here. They're trying to nail the patsy and provide ironclad proof that he is the assassin, he's guilty, but then also show his connections to Cuba and the Soviets so that they can get the war that they want. That's the whole point of this. But the problem is the voice doesn't match. The language is clearly, the way that this impersonator speaks the Russian language is not the way that Lee Harvey Oswald speaks the Russian language. The voice doesn't match, and the images don't match. So all of a sudden, this story becomes here's another picture of him. If that's Lee Harvey Oswald, I got a bridge I want to sell you in Arizona somewhere. It's clearly not him. Even Hoover, when he briefs that same day on the 23rd, he had to brief LBJ, and he says, quote, because LBJ asked him about it. What about this Mexico City stuff? That looks pretty bad, right? Because none of the public are seeing these pictures. None of the public are hearing the recordings, or hearing the voice, or hearing the Russian language, but the FBI knows. They're the ones processing all the evidence. And they're like, well, we have the tape. We have the photograph of the man who was at the Soviet embassy using Oswald's name. Now, remember, Hoover already knows someone's been impersonating Oswald going back all the way to 60. So to him, this is anything new. He says the tape and the photograph of the man who was at the Soviet embassy do not correspond to this man, talking about Oswald's voice, nor to his appearance. So internally, the FBI knows this is bullshit. And that's essentially what Hoover's telling LBJ. This is bullshit. The whole Mexico City thing, this CIA, he is exposing to LBJ. He's, without saying so much in so many words, he's telling LBJ the CIA is full shit. Don't believe this Mexico City stuff that they're telling you. It's not. That wasn't Oswald. That was an impersonator. So though it was internally debunked by the FBI on the 23rd, while Oswald's still alive, right? This is exculpatory. The story persists to this day, and it made it into the Warren Commission report. Even though we have on record Hoover telling the President of the United States this is bullshit. Same day. Of course, it's in everybody's best interest who's in part of this plot to, once they've produced the so-called assassination rifle, which they no doubt took from Ruth Paine's garage, planted it up there in the Texas School Book Depository, replacing the German Mauser there he said they found. But they'd sure like to find Lee Harvey Oswald's fingerprints on it. Boy, that would really go a long way to proving. Obviously, he had the rifle in his hands that day. They found it in the Texas School Book Depository. So that's going a long way, at least in the eyes of the public. Not sure it would pass muster in a court, but it would at least prove to the public that he did it, right? So they were very anxious to find some fingerprints on that rifle. Unfortunately, after trying and trying and trying. According to J. Edgar Hoover himself, he says, quote, no prints were developed on Oswald's revolver, the cartridge cases, the unfired cartridge, the clip, or the inner parts of the rifle. Now they have Oswald's prints because they've arrested him, and they're trying very hard to find a print on that rifle. And here's another. This is a copy of the memo where he says that no latent prints of value were developed on Oswald's rifle, cartridge cases, the unfired cartridge, the clip in the rifle, the inner parts of the rifle. So that's been a frustration, right? But they'll fix that in a minute. Meanwhile, while this is all going on, there's been a new book that's come out written by John Currington. John Currington was the lawyer for H.O. Hunt. And as such, everywhere H.O. Hunt was during this period of time, John Currington was there with him. He handled all his business, payroll, all his contract negotiations, everything. So his office, he shared an office space. There was a wall and a door between them, but the door was always open. So he knew who was coming and seeing H.O. Hunt. Most of the time, he was in there with him. And he's just written a book. It's a very interesting book. It has a lot of very interesting things to say. Let's plug that information in, because at the same time all of this is happening in and around Dallas, Currington is being called to meet with H.O. Hunt. And he says, quote, he called me about 4 or 5 o'clock in the evening. This is on the 23rd. So Oswald's been arrested. He's been in jail now for a day. He calls me about 4 or 5 o'clock, and he asked me to go down to the police station. I got a picture here of the police station. That's that side view. And if you look down to the bottom left of that picture on the bottom, you see that ramp and the garage door entrance where Ruby will walk down that ramp and kill Oswald on the 24th. That's the side view. But anyway, he asked me to go down to the police station and check on what security, if any, was around Lee Harvey Oswald. Whenever you find out what I want to know about security, come to the house. So Currington says, I went down to the police station. I had no trouble walking in or walking out. I did have a briefcase with me. Nobody looked in that briefcase. And I was satisfied that there was no security whatsoever surrounding Lee Harvey Oswald. He tells the story of one time getting on an elevator, and at the last minute before the elevator door shut, on walks into the elevator a policeman escorting Lee Harvey Oswald to an interrogation room. And so for a brief elevator ride, he was literally in the elevator with the alleged suspect, or the alleged shooter of JFK. And could have pulled a gun right out of his briefcase and shot him right there if he wanted to. Nobody checked his briefcase. Now, he himself was a lawyer, and he had a client in the Dallas jail down there. And so that was his cover. He was going down there to meet with his client. But he literally wandered around for several hours, doing what his boss asked him to do, which is just check out the level of security around the Harry Oswald. So he goes back and he reports this. And when he asked Hunt why he had him do this, Currington said that Hunt said he wanted Lee Harvey Oswald silenced without having any kind of court hearing or anything else. He was concerned about Oswald's possible motive being tied to Hunt's radio program, a radio program called Lifeline, that had been spreading derogatory information about JFK. I believe that was cover. Maybe he was concerned about the radio program. Maybe he was. I think he more or less just wanted Ruby silenced for bigger reasons, because we already know Hunt belonged to that same sweet 8F group LBJ and all these others, Hoover, et cetera, belonged to. They just wanted Oswald silenced. But he told his attorney it was because, well, they got that radio program and we're always blasting JFK. And I'd hate for Oswald to get up and say that the reason he killed JFK was because he heard my radio show. I think that was cover. Anyway, according to Currington, that Lifeline program targeted JFK, MLK, and RFK almost on a daily basis, calling them anti-American. And it was clear, because that was Hunt's radio program that he paid for, that those were his three biggest political enemies during this period, because it never stopped attacking those three over and over and over again during this period. So uh, Currington was asked, or wrote in his book, that the very next thing that happened was uh, Hunt told him, uh, I want you to get a hold of Joe Savella, who was the Dallas mob boss, and have him here as early as he could be Sunday morning. And so he calls up Joe Savella, tells him about his conversation with his boss, Hunt, and uh, arranges for Savella and Hunt to meet the next morning. So who is Joe Savella? Joe Savella owned a liquor store, and at the end of the Love Field runway, which at that time, that was the main airport coming in and out of Dallas. And this liquor store was sort of a front through which Savella laundered all of his racketeering cash. And he had, on many occasions with Hunt, met Joe Savella at this liquor store, because this liquor store served as his office. You know, these mafiosos always have their offices in the back of the restaurant, or like in Carlos Marcello's case, at a town and country motel on the exit in New Orleans, or in a liquor store. They hide their offices. They don't have an office in the sense that you think of an office. Anyway, Currington had been there many times previously with Hunt, uh, conducting business with Savella, so he's very familiar with this liquor store. And the according to Currington, the topic, and this is what he expounds on in his book. He says, we'd met with them previous. Interestingly, one of the previous times that we met, the topic of conversation brought up by my boss, Hunt, was he asked Savella for advice on how to kill somebody. Hunt asked, Hunt was an oil guy. And so he's asking Savella, who was a mafioso, uh, how to form a kill squad that could kill somebody and get away with it. And he said that Savella laid it out for him. He says, well, you never give one team all the responsibility. So if you're going to create a kill squad, you divide it into three teams. You have team A that makes the decision who the target's going to be. You have team B that makes the decision how the target's going to be neutralized, how they're going to kill him. And then team C actually kills the target. So you compartmentalize the responsibility, break it up so that not all of the responsibility falls on one team. You break it up. He's basically teaching H.O. Hunt how to create a kill squad. This is according to Currington, who's sitting in on this meeting. And he said in a subsequent meeting, Savella says, he asked Savella, Hunt does, well, okay, if I'm going to commit a murder, how do I do it with these teams that you're talking about? How do I do it without ever being traced back to me? So Savella is kind of giving him a graduate level course on how to commit murder and get away with it. And according to Currington, Savella's advice was, if you want to get away with it, you either kill the killer or you buy him off so that he'll plead guilty or confess afterwards. You get whatever means necessary to buy him off so that he'll confess or plead guilty. If neither of those options work, then he killed the killer. So in this book, and I would highly recommend it, it's called Motive and Opportunity. Hunt, through Currington, who handled all of these negotiations and all these transactions, made the connection between Hunt and the assassinations of JFK, MLK, and RFK, whom I already mentioned on the Lifeline program, is being all three of those are being targeted daily by H.O. Hunt as being his main political enemies. And in a 5-year span, all three of them are assassinated. And Currington was there, front and center, as Hunt's right-hand man, and has information, which he puts in this book, that connects Hunt to all three. Now, we're talking about the Ruby one right now, but if you read the book, he lays out a case that his boss took the advice of Joseph and handled these three killers in the exact same way that Joseph recommended that he handle them. For example, remember he said kill the killer. Well, in the JFK case, Ruby kills the killer, Oswald, the alleged killer. In the MLK case, remember he says use whatever means necessary to buy off the attorney and force the defendant either to confess or to plead guilty. Well, in the MLK case, James Earl Ray was conned by his attorney into pleading guilty as a result of a huge payoff that, according to Currington, he handled on behalf of Hunt. It was $125,000 that he personally delivered to Percy Foreman, the attorney on record for MLK. And the next day, James Earl Ray pleads guilty. And then the third scenario was RFK, just a month or two later, where he personally delivered $40,000 to the attorney of record out there. And the next day, Sirhan confessed. So it's a result of, after having worked through these three transactions, Currington has had time to think about it over the years, and he's realized, my God, those meetings that we had at the liquor store with Joe Savella, where Joe Savella taught my boss how to kill somebody with a kill squad, divided into three teams, and then how to get away with it by either killing the killer or buying off the attorney who would force his defendant, his client, into either pleading guilty or confessing. That's exactly what happened in all three of these cases. And then he plugs into the fact, these scenarios, the fact that he was the one who sent the money to Chicago that eventually made it into Ruby's bank account. He hand delivered the money to Memphis, which was used as a bribe to Percy Foreman, MLK's lawyer, which resulted in a guilty plea. He hand delivered the money to the attorney on record in the RFK case, which the next day resulted in a confession. And so it's his contention that H.O. Hunt was paying off, his connection to these three assassinations was to pay off the alleged killer, the patsies in all three cases, so that they would take the rap for it and the real killers would get away. And that's how Joseph Ellis said to do it. The real people walk and the patsies take the rap for it. But you got to pay them. You got to, or kill them. So back to the story. So he's arranged a meeting with Joe Savella and H.O. Hunt. So on the 24th, the meeting takes place, according to Currington, about 7:30 a.m. on Sunday. Dallas mob boss Joe Savella arrives at H.O. Hunt's big Mount Vernon estate there in Dallas. And they have this meeting. That's at 7:30. At 10:35, about 3 hours later, Ira Walker, who's a TV technician, sitting outside Dallas Police Headquarters in a news van waiting for Oswald to be transported so they can get news coverage of it. He's sitting outside, and according to Walker, Jack Ruby comes up to the van window, knocks on the van window, and when he rolls down the window, Ruby says to Walker, quote, "Has he been brought down yet?" So now we have Ruby on the scene at 10:30. And this is, according to Currington, a result of a very systematic order of events where Hunt, on the 23rd, calls Currington. They meet, and he gives them instructions. Currington goes down, looks at the security there at the Dallas Police Headquarters, reports back to Hunt. So now Hunt says, I want you to bring Savella in tomorrow morning and meet with me. So now you have Hunt and Currington plus Savella, which results in Ruby, which results in Oswald being shot. Because Ruby was very well known in Dallas to be connected to the mob. The head of the Dallas mob was Joe Savella, who's now been brought into this situation by Hunt and Currington to take care of or silence Oswald before he can say anything at a hearing or in a trial. So you just follow the progression. You use common sense. You just follow the progression. Hunt and Currington, what they're up to. Currington says it's all about silencing Oswald. So they bring Savella in. Savella brings Ruby in because Ruby's one of his guys, right? And we know Ruby was there because Ira Walker said he was there, according to the conversation that he had. So that conversation took place at 10:35. At 11:15 or 17, Ruby walks down an alley, passes through a crowd, enters the ramp into the police station garage, and positions himself directly in front of the door while Oswald's going to exit. And of course, no one thinks to. He's well known. He'd been at Dallas Police Headquarters the entire weekend already. He'd been at news conferences. He'd been up and down the hallways. Uh, he was well known at Dallas Police Headquarters because he paid half of them were on his payroll, helping him run his nightclub, providing security, etc. He comped him drinks and free shows with the ladies, etc., etc. So they all knew him. Ruby was one of them, right? And so it's not a big deal that he's there. At 11:21, out comes Oswald, and there's Ruby waiting for him. Ruby shoots him at 11:21, and by 1:07, FBI informant Oswald is dead. Ironically, killed by another FBI informant, Jack Ruby. Isn't that interesting? And according to John Currington, this was all arranged by H.L. Hunt, which the reason I tell this story is because H.L. Hunt's part of that Sweet 8F Mafia group, or that Sweet 8F group that ran Texas, that was behind trying to push LBJ up into the White House. And of course, J. Edgar Hoover was part of that Sweet 8F group. These big oil guys were the ones who paid all the bills, as evidenced by the fact that $125,000 went to pay off Percy Foreman and the MLK situation. $40,000 went to RFK's lawyer, or the lawyer representing Sirhan Sirhan in the RFK situation. And no doubt there was a deal struck between Hunt and Savella to involve Ruby in the shooting of Oswald. And as we're going to find out in the direct aftermath, this is according to an FBI memo, so the FBI knows. It was learned earlier, between 1957 and 1960, by the McClellan Committee, that the FBI already knew that Jack Ruby had connections to the mob. Okay, they already knew that they had dug up the name of a Chicago mobster, and his name was Jack Ruby, or Rubenstein. He called himself Ruby. And he was connected to all the mafia and all their doings and goings on, which was connected to the CIA and trying to overthrow Castro. This memo, dated November 24, 1963, according to Bobby Kennedy's own personal investigator, Walter Sheridan, who's looking into the mafia and its role in the JFK assassination, reported that Ruby had been paid off in Chicago by Teamsters boss Jimmy Hoffa. Now, here's a picture here of Jimmy Hoffa on the left, and on the right is Alan Dorfman. According to this FBI memo, Ruby, quote, picked up a bundle of money from Alan Dorfman, who was the stepson of Paul Dorfman, Hoffa's link to the Chicago mob, in the days before the assassination. And there's all kinds of evidence in the days before the assassination of Ruby running around Dallas, hiding his money, basically, giving his attorney the power of attorney over his bank account, because I think he knows in advance he's going to be sitting in a jail cell somewhere, and somebody he trusts has to be in control of that bank account. And he came into this big sum of money in the days right before the assassination. This is right after Hunt had ordered John Currington to arrange for a $70,000 cash payment to be delivered to Chicago just a few weeks before. So you start putting these puzzle pieces together. Currington's putting them together in his head. And he's saying, okay, several weeks before the assassination, I had to hand deliver or arrange for $70,000 cash to be delivered to Chicago. And then you plug that in with what the FBI learned, and they learned that Jack Ruby, in the days before the assassination, received a big cash payment from Alan Dorfman. Alan Dorfman was part of the link between Jimmy Hoffa and the mob, and what Currington suspects is that money that he delivered, that $70,000 cash, was the money that Jimmy Hoffa and Alan Dorfman funneled to. And of course, Jimmy Hoffa at the time of the assassination was sitting in a jail cell. So that's why Alan Dorfman's handling it. So what Currington suspects is that that money was funneled through Dorfman to Ruby. And then that's the deal that was struck between H.O. Hunt and Savella. I just sent $70,000 to Chicago for somebody from your operation, from the mafia, to take out this suspect, Oswald, before he can speak at a hearing or a trial. That $70,000 cash made it into Ruby's pocket. And that was the payment that he received to carry out on behalf. Now, Ruby had motive too, because we all know that Ruby had big time debts that he owed to the Chicago mob. The Chicago mob had sent him to Dallas to open these nightclubs, and he got head over heels in debt to them. So not only was he getting a cash payment, I'm sure there was some deal for Ruby in exchange for his silence, in exchange for him taking the fall on this, that those debts would go away. If he killed Oswald, he had to kill him. He couldn't injure him, he couldn't wound him, he had to kill him. And so, anyway, Currington's putting all these pieces together in his mind, and it's very convincing when you start to see the flow of events here and the chronological timetable as well. You start to see that this money started with Hunt, went through Currington to Savella's contacts back in Chicago, and it was funneled through Dorfman to Ruby so that Ruby would carry out the hit of Oswald on the 24th. And then when you match it against what happened later in Memphis and in LA, it's the same MO repeated 3 times, the exact same MO. And Currington was right smack in the middle of it because he is the guy who handles all this kind of business for his boss, Hunt. And of course, Hunt is connected to Hoover through this sweet 8F Mafia group they ran out of the Lamar Hotel in Houston. He's part of that same mafia group that included LBJ, Richard Nixon, Hoover, Hunt, Sid Richardson, Clint Murchison, Harold Dryholes-Byrd, who owned the Texas School Book Depository, Murchison, where they had the big party the night before. They're all the same people. It's unbelievable. All right, back to Hosty. You remember the story that prior to the assassination, Oswald had burst into the FBI building and he wanted to see Hosty. Hosty wasn't there, so he left this note that the secretary read. It was a threat to bomb the building, et cetera, if Hosty didn't leave his wife alone. We left that story alone at that point because I said there was more to it. Now we're finally to it. This is 2 days after the assassination. Now Oswald's been killed. And so now there's going to be a lot of light on that scenario and what happened there. That who's this Oswald guy? There's going to be no stopping the investigation into Oswald's background. And so Hosty destroys Oswald's alleged threatening note. Just gets rid of it. Here again, destruction of evidence. That would have been a very handy note to have to point towards motive, to point towards state of mind, what he's capable of. I mean, it shows clear if it was indeed a threatening note to the FBI, threatening to bomb the FBI or threatening harm to Hosty, whatever, that would be very convincing evidence to show the American people that this guy Oswald was a loose cannon, that he was making threats in the days leading up to the assassination, personal and institutional. Personal towards Hosty, institutional towards the FBI building, that he was capable of violence. I mean, that is a very key piece of evidence, right? To show premeditation and to show state of mind, what he's capable of, all these things. So the question is, why on earth did Hosty destroy it? The FBI is trying to pin everything on Oswald. This is the kind of evidence you want to keep. Why would he destroy the note? Hosty maintained that Gordon Shanklin, pictured Hosty here is the guy on the right. Gordon Shanklin is his boss on the left. He said that Gordon Shanklin, who was head of the Dallas FBI field office, ordered him to destroy the note. Shanklin denied it later, but even the assistant FBI director, William Sullivan, said it was true. So clearly Shanklin was lying about uh, ordering Hosty. I sort of believe Hosty in this thing. He was just kind of caught in the middle. But Shanklin ordered him to destroy it. Even the House Select Committee later, when they reviewed the incident, they said Shanklin was lying. So the liar in this situation, most likely, is Shanklin. He did order Hosty to destroy it, which begs the question, why? The evidence, if you believe what they say the letter said, they would have produced it. Which the movie JFK called this into question, and I think it's a legitimate inquiry. Why would the FBI destroy a note which would only serve to confirm Oswald's violent character? In that famous scene in the movie, they're sitting there at that uh, that restaurant down at the front in the French Quarter. I forget the name of it. I've been to it. I can't remember the name of it. Anyway, they're sitting there eating, and he's talking to his staff. He says, "What if the note was describing an upcoming assassination attempt on JFK?" And that's why they destroyed it. It doesn't make any sense. If it was a threat, like they said it was a threat, they would have produced it. There's no need to destroy it. In fact, you want to preserve it. But what if it's actually a note warning of the assassination? And that's why they destroyed it, because they can't have Lee Harvey Oswald warning of an assassination attempt that later happens. And now he's dead. JFK's dead and he's dead. And the FBI ignored it. So they destroyed the evidence. And especially when you take into consideration, juxtapose it against what happened earlier in Chicago, when an FBI informant named Lee called the Chicago FBI field office warning of a four-Cuban assassin team that was going to take out Kennedy in an assassination in a motorcade on November 2, just 20 days prior. His warning succeeded in getting the White House to cancel that trip. Would not it be plausible to at least consider the fact that this might be the same Lee? We already know he's an FBI informant. So the same FBI informant Lee warning of another assassination attempt to be attempted here in Dallas. And because the FBI, in my belief, in my view, was fully invested in this attempt succeeding by this point, or at least covering for the CIA, which is carrying it out, they can't have any evidence emerge afterwards that shows that there was another informant who warned them, and it happens to be the guy they set up as the patsy and took it, and he's now dead. It'd make the FBI look terrible, point blank, just terrible. If there was a note that existed that Lee Harvey Oswald warned them of an assassination attempt in Dallas. So they made up a story. This is what they do. When the CIA dropped a story about Oswald being in Mexico City and the picture didn't work out, or the voice recordings didn't work out, they just make the picture disappear. They make the voice recordings disappear, and all they have left are written transcripts, which is basically us having to take their word for it that this happened. Now here's the FBI doing the same thing. It was a note warning that he was going to blow up the FBI. Really? Show it to me. Well, we can't. Why not? We destroyed it. Why'd you destroy it? That's evidence that shows Oswald's guilt. Well, Gordon Shanklin made me, and Gordon Shanklin denied, and they just obfuscate. And, the only reason they destroyed that letter is because I believe it was an FBI informant, Leon, was warning of another assassination attempt, and they could not have that evidence ever see the light of day. If it's what they say it is, they would have produced it. And so here again, we're being asked by an intelligence agency to just believe their version of it. When the CIA produces the pictures and the voice recordings that don't match, they're clearly not, they just say, well, believe the written transcript. Just believe that happened exactly the way it happened. And when the FBI says, destroys a note, well, it was because it was a note he was going to blow up the building, he was going to seek revenge on Hosty personally, whatever. Where's the note? Well, we destroyed it. So just believe us, that's what we saw. And they trot out some secretary and they use her to corroborate their version. That doesn't make any sense. It's just like when John Quigley destroyed all his notes back in New Orleans after Oswald was arrested. Again, they have this long, hours long meeting. He destroys his notes. It's a pattern. And the only reason you destroy that evidence is if it's exculpatory towards Oswald and it shows foreknowledge by the FBI. You can't have that evidence ever see the light of day. So you destroy it. And then you fill in the blanks with what you want the American people to believe. There's just no evidence of it, but people believe it because the FBI said it. This is Nick Katzenbach. He's the assistant AG, and we're talking about crafting the narrative. Well, now the narrative's already been set, and Oswald's dead. So now it's about appeasing the public or proving to the public that Oswald would have been proven guilty if there had been a trial. So that, there's no, because I promise you, there's a lot of American people, even in 1963, which pretty much the trust factor that American people had in our institution was pretty high. They believed the FBI. They believed the CIA. They believed Dallas police. They believed the president. They believed the Warren Commission. They were conditioned to believe. I know when I speak about this to the older generation, many times that's the hang up because they grew up believing and having faith in our institutions. It's not such a big hang up anymore. Younger generations don't have that faith because we've been lied to so many times and things been proven false that the government told us so many times. But in the older generations, they believe. And so it was very important to the Justice Department and the infrastructure of this cover up that the American people buy into this narrative. So here in an inter-office memo, Nicholas Katzenbach gives the marching orders to everybody that, you got the Attorney General, and underneath that, you got the FBI and all the law enforcement mechanisms of the United States. They all, in the hierarchy, the Justice Department is the boss, right? The Attorney General is the boss, the Assistant Attorney General, and everybody falls in line underneath them. And so he is basically spelling out in this inter-office memo the marching orders as he sees it going forward, and that is to convince the public or to satisfy the public that Oswald was the assassin. You read right in the first paragraph of the memo, the public must be satisfied that Oswald was the assassin, that he did not have Confederates, no conspiracy, who are still at large. Oswald being shot dead, that's the end of it. There's no one past him. And that the evidence was such he would have been convicted at trial. Open and shut. That's the marching orders of everybody connected to this case with respect to the government. That's what we're after. And this wasn't supposed to leak. No one outside was supposed to see this. But boy, what a window into what happens next as far as the investigation is concerned. I told you that the FBI was very intent on trying to prove that the rifle, was Oswald's. They wanted to find some fingerprints, is what they wanted. And on November 25th, the day after he died, there's the story of Paul Grudy, who's running. He's a mortician. He's handling Oswald's body. He's got him all cleaned up, dressed up. They've done the autopsy. He had to clean his hands and clean his face and dress him up in a suit and tie and everything, get him ready for burial. And he says at early in the morning on the 25th, agents from the FBI showed up and they wanted access to the body. And one of them was carrying a rifle and the other was carrying what looked like a fingerprint kit or some sort of a kit. It was in a box. And they told Paul Grudy to wait in the front. And he was aggravated because when they left an hour or so later, he'd come back and he had to basically do all his work all over again. He had oil all over his hands and on the cuff of his shirts, or on the sleeve of his shirt. And so he had to undress him, redress him, clean his hands, clean his everything back up again. And it was aggravating to him, but he didn't really think much of it. And he had asked the FBI officer, the agent, he says, "Why do you have that gun?" And they said, "Well, we're just looking at his, this is for comparison purposes," which he didn't know what that meant. But he said that's what he told him. That it was brought for, quote, comparison purposes. Immediately that afternoon, guess what emerges? A new palm print from Oswald's hand on the so-called Oswald rifle, the Mannlicher Carcano, magically appears after all this fingerprinting has been going on from the 22nd to the 23rd. Now he's dead on the 24th. On the 25th, they come out with a palm print that was no doubt taken from his dead hand and applied to the butt of that gun, right? That rifle. And now all of a sudden they have the link. They have the connection there that they needed. But they couldn't do it until Oswald was dead. That's a detail a lot of people don't realize. So now we're to the 26th. The FBI comes in. Now they've been to Ruth Payne's house several times, and they've been to his rooming house. And on the 26th, in his rooming house, they find a tiny Minox camera. This was not a camera that was available to the public. This was only a camera used by spies, which means the only place you can get it was through the CIA or the FBI, one of the intelligence agencies. It's not available to the public. And you can see clearly in that top picture there that they itemized this on the evidence report as a Minox camera. And I highlighted that for a reason, because later, when the FBI is asked to, when the evidence is compiled within the Warren Commission, which is funneled to it directly through the FBI, the camera evidence disappears after the FBI took possession of it. And later, when they were asked to describe what they found, when they were asked about this Minox camera, they said, well, it wasn't a camera, it was a light meter. I've got two places here where you see that this is very much similar to the German Mauser, which, according to multiple witnesses in the Texas School Book Depository building after the assassination on the 6th floor, they found a rifle stashed behind boxes, and they clearly identified it as a German Mauser. And it was identified, it documented on these evidence documents. And then later, after the Mannlicher was found, it suddenly became the Mannlicher instead of the German Mauser. And you never heard any talk anymore about the German Mauser. But according to witnesses on the scene, that gun was a German Mauser that they found, not a Mannlicher Carcano. Well, here we go. Again, they found a Minox camera. This is no doubt the Dallas police searching his rooming house, and they dutifully documented it as a Minox camera in several places, as you can see here. And it was only later, when the evidence was turned over to the FBI, that they realized if we leave this as a Minox camera, this ties him to intelligence, because this camera is not available on the open market. The only way he could have gotten it was through us or the CIA. So we cannot allow this evidence to ever see the light of day. Sound familiar? You're going to hear that a lot. So they change it to a light meter, and they destroy the actual written evidence in the official ledger, or whatever you want to call it, and so that there is no written documentation that it was a Minox camera, and they change it to a light meter, so as to not feed any suspicion out there that's starting to formulate that Oswald was intelligence. I started to say this earlier. I think I lost my train of thought, and I skipped right over it. Most people who were so trusting of the American government at this time believed everything they were being told by Oswald. From the 22nd to the 23rd to early in the 24th, it was sort of becoming concrete in the opinions and the minds of the American people that Oswald acted alone. They're believing what the authorities are telling them. The evidence that is being published makes it look pretty bad for Oswald. It wasn't until he was shot by Ruby that the light bulb started to go off for a lot of Americans saying, wait a second, wait a second. He's in police protection. This is the most notorious man in the world at this time. And they let this guy walk right down the ramp and kill him. Wait a second. This looks like somebody trying to get rid of somebody, setting up a patsy, trying to get rid of him. That something's not right about this. That was the moment for some, not for all, but for some, that caused enough suspicion to want to look into this further. And so the FBI is very aware that there is a growing suspicion out there that Oswald was more than meets the eye. He's not just this lone gunman, flunky, you know. He's been to Russia. He speaks Russian. Everybody knows Russian is a very hard language to learn as an adult. So he's clearly intelligent. He married a Russian woman. He uh, he's he was, all these connections to the military. Just in the direct aftermath, there was enough to at least cause suspicion. And of course, as time went on, more and more, and people in Dallas were very suspicious because they knew Ruby was mobbed up. Notwithstanding all the efforts by the FBI and the Warren Commission later to say he wasn't, Dallas knew he was. So now it looks like a mob hit. So there are suspicions that are sort of forming in the undercurrent there that this is not what the government is saying it is. So they have to be very careful to remove any evidence documented that shows that Oswald could have been anything other than a flunky. All right, back to James Hosty again. So now the FBI is keen on interrogating Marina Oswald. So they send James Hosty out to interrogate, and she refuses. She flat out will not talk to this guy. She don't trust him. In her mind, and of course, her husband's dead. He's been accused of killing the president. And in her mind, in the months leading up to just the weeks and months leading up to it, this guy had been ever present in their life all of a sudden in Dallas. He made several trips out to the Ruth Payne house, talked to her, talked to Ruth. He had an open file on Oswald by his own admission when he told Lieutenant Jack Revel in the parking garage. We had a file on him. We knew who he was. He'd been in regular contact, so much up to and including even Oswald going to the FBI office to meet with him, allegedly to give a threatening note to him. We have the interaction between him and Revel, which I told you that story. And then we have the fact that he destroys the so-called warning note. Hosty's neck deep in this, which means the FBI's neck deep in this, because that's what he is. He's an FBI officer. And Marina refuses on the 26th to be interviewed by him because she suspects, right, that Hosty knows a lot more than he's letting on. And he has not got her best interest at heart, certainly doesn't have her husband's best interest, her late husband's best interest at heart. She don't trust him. Remember, she's the same lady that crawled out the back window, ran around the house, and got his license plate number. She didn't trust him from the beginning. There's something about him she didn't trust. All right. That brings us to November 27th. And now remember, I told you we would come back to this story with Jack Martin and what's going on in New Orleans. So the New Orleans Police Department interrogated Jack Martin after he got pistol whipped by Guy Bannister. And eventually Jim Garrison talks to him about it. And he wants to talk to David Ferry. He wants to find out, all right, let's interview somebody else from this office. And he had already heard from Frank Martin that Ferry had gone to Houston, and he was supposed to be the getaway pilot for Oswald after the assassination. So sure enough, he inquires and he finds out Ferry's out of town. When he gets back into town on November 27th, he questions David Ferry and he asks him, why'd you go to Houston? And Ferry makes up a story about going goose hunting. And maybe if Garrison had not already had that prior conversation with Jack Martin, maybe he buys it. But he knows this is not believable. So he holds him and he says, I'm going to refer you over to the FBI, which is in charge of this whole case, because I don't believe your story. So sure enough, the FBI shows up. They interview Ferry on the 27th, and they promptly release him. They hold a public press conference. They promptly release him and offer him a public apology for his trouble, which completely undercut Jim Garrison. They threw Garrison and New Orleans under the bus, issuing this very unusual statement that it wasn't the FBI that ever wanted to question FBI or Barry. It was Garrison and the New Orleans DA. And due to insufficient evidence, he was being released. And they basically washed their hands of the whole New Orleans connection. And Garrison, who is a former FBI officer himself and has utmost confidence in the FBI at that point in time, says to his office, well, the FBI knows more than we do. And if Ferry is innocent or if there's no connection, there's not enough evidence, then if it's good enough for the FBI, it's good enough for me. And he just drops the case at that moment in time. He just drops the investigation based on the say-so of the FBI. That is a very important point right there. Again, based on what the FBI said. 2 days later, this is now 1 week after the assassination, LBJ and Hoover meet and they have the following conversation, which of course is in the Oval Office, so it's documented, it's recorded. LBJ says, quote, were they aiming at the president? Hoover says, they were aiming directly at the president. LBJ, how did it happen that they hit Connally? Hoover says, Connally turned to the president when the first shot was fired, and I think in that turning, it is where he got hit. LBJ says, if he hadn't turned, he probably wouldn't have gotten hit. Hoover says, I think that is very likely. LBJ says, would the president have gotten hit by the second one? Hoover, no, the president wasn't hit with the second one. LBJ, I say, if Connally hadn't been in the way, and of course, we all know Connally was in front of Kennedy in the car. Hoover says, oh, yes, the president will no doubt have been hit. LBJ says, he would have been hit 3 times. Hoover says, yes, he would have been hit 3 times. A couple things interesting in this dialogue is first, their use of the pronoun they. In the early part of the dialogue, nowhere do they say he. Was he aiming at the president? Was he aiming directly at yes, he hit Connally. Hoover and LBJ are both using the pronoun they, which I think is very instructive because they're not the only ones who use the word they. You know, a lot of the witnesses on Dealey Plaza, Jackie Kennedy, for example, they. When they told her to remove her, they advised that she remove her pink suit before she posed in that picture, Air Force One with LBJ taking the oath. She says, no, I want them, talking about the American people, to see what they've done. Talking about multiple shooters. And of course, she had blood all over her suit. So this is sort of an unscripted moment, an admission by the 2 powers that be that benefited the most from this JFK assassination, that there wasn't one shooter, it was multiple shooters. And the other interesting thing I've highlighted is the fact that the Hoover is admitting to the president that the president would have been hit 3 times if not for Connally, which, because Connally was in front of Kennedy, he took one of the bullets, which means one of the shots had to come from the front. Couldn't it come from behind? Because according to what Hoover is saying, if Connally had not stopped that one bullet, it would have hit Kennedy a 3rd time. So that means since Connally is in front, that one of those shots had to come from the front. At least that's what Hoover is saying to Johnson. LBJ asks him point blank, was he trying to hit him 3 times? Yes. Why didn't he get hit 3 times? Well, because Connolly was in front of him. Connolly took one of the bullets, essentially. And if Connolly hadn't taken that bullet, all 3 of them would have hit Kennedy. So the placement of Connolly in front of Kennedy stopped one of those bullets from hitting Kennedy. Well, the fact that he's in front means one of those shots had to have come from in front. And Hoover is essentially admitting that to Johnson in this conversation. So the fact that they're using the pronoun they, and the fact that they're saying Connolly stopped one of the bullets from hitting Johnson, and that can only happen if a shot's coming from the front, is indicative that they both know that evidence is going to have to be manipulated to show all the shots coming from behind and above. Because the fact that Connolly got hit is a huge complicating factor, and they know it. All right, back to the Suite 8F Currington / Hunt story, because the story gets stranger. Now, when we left off, we said Currington was telling the story about how he took $70,000 to Chicago. That $70,000 ends up in Ruby's bank account, and he ends up killing Oswald, which was what the original setup was when Currington was sent by Hunt to scope out the security of Oswald at the Dallas Police Headquarters and bring Joe Savella into it. Joe Savella brings Ruby into it. All right, we told that story. Now, what's the second part of the story? December 7th. We are now a couple weeks removed. Hunt calls Currington again. He says, I want you to go downtown to our building, send everybody home. Everybody, we got these high-rise buildings for my oil company, send everybody home. Which was interesting. It was on a Saturday. I didn't realize they'd be working on a Saturday, but they did. Anyway, he sends everybody home. And he says, I want you to stand at the floor level entrance. And if anybody tries to come in, I want you to stop them. I want the building empty. Anybody who might be trying to arrive to work late, stop them. So get everybody who's already there gone and stop anybody who comes in late. So Currington goes down and he's standing in the lobby and he's carrying out Hunt's instructions. And after a period of time, he observes Hunt arrive in his big fancy car, parks right in front of the building. And he walks right by him. No, this never happened. This is why it stood out to Currington. When Hunt walked into the building, he just brushed right past Currington and continued on to the elevator. Didn't say hi, didn't say anything. And Currington said that was normal. We always spoke. I was his right hand. Anyway, he didn't even ask if I'd done what he asked him. He just assumed I did. He walked right past me. A few minutes later, he's still standing down there in the lobby. A few minutes later, a big black car with government plates arrives at the front of the building, and a woman gets out of the car and comes into the building. And Currington instantly recognizes this is Marina Oswald. Marina Oswald, 2 weeks after the assassination, is entering the building after her boss, or his boss, entered a few minutes earlier, and after he had told him to empty the building. This is now all of a sudden he's understanding why he was told to empty the building. Marina enters the same elevator Hunt had entered earlier, goes to the same floor that Hunt had gone to. Of course, the buttons light up, Currington noticed. 20 minutes later, Marina comes back, exits the elevator, exits the building, goes, gets him back, same government plated car, and off they go. And a few minutes after that, here comes Hunt. He comes down the elevator, he exits the building, gets in his car, and he leaves. This all happened within a few short hours on December 7th. And of course, we know that in the aftermath of the assassination, Marina Oswald was in the custody of the FBI. They were keeping her at the Six Flags Hotel. And they kept her there for weeks after the assassination, interrogating her, and trying to, we found out later from her own lips that they were threatening her. They were telling her, if you don't give us the information that we want, or do for us what we want you to do, which we're going to find out here in a minute what that is, then we're going to deport you. You're not an American citizen. You have two kids that have dual citizenship. We're going to keep the kids here. We're going to deport you back to Russia. And they just work her and work her and work her. And in the middle of all that sequence, they bring her downtown to this building, up to the Hunt building. She meets obviously with Hunt. And the fact that she's in this big black car with government plates is further corroboration. She's in the custody of the government, which who's in control of the investigation? It's the FBI. She's in FBI custody. So what happens right after that? She gives an interview to KRLD TV. And it's very famous. It's the first time she spoke. Everyone's hanging on everything she's saying because this is the wife of the alleged assassin. And she says in broken English, quote, "I don't want to believe, but I have too much fact, and fact tell me this, that Lee Harvey Oswald, her husband, was guilty of shooting the president." Oh, you talk about slamming the door shut on any conspiracy theories or government involvement or anything. The wife is now coming, and they doll her up, put her in this pretty dress, do her hair up real pretty, and she comes out. She looks real innocent, victim-y, she barely knows English, but she's saying what they want. They primed her in this meeting. Now, put in the context with everything else Currington has told us so far about his boss buying off either the confession of a patsy or the guilty plea of a passion or buying off the murder of a patsy. Now here you have Marina brought to his building, meeting with him, and then going right out afterwards and saying what the FBI no doubt wanted her to say. And the obvious conclusion is that she too was bought off by the same guy in furtherance of the narrative. This is all about cementing this narrative and making it become a hard fact in the minds of the American people. It's unbelievable. It's an unbelievable story. And there's a little bit more to it here in a minute. That same day, so that's January 26th, that same day, Harold Feldman from The Nation confirms what two previous authors, newspaper writers, had posited as a theory and couldn't quite confirm. He confirms it on January 27, 1964, that, quote, Oswald, Lee Harvey Oswald, was an FBI confidential informant. They found his agent number. They found his pay stubs. He was getting paid $200 a month by the FBI. So now we know for a fact, this is no longer speculation. This is no longer, well, we suspect he's an FBI informant because he got let back into the country so easily after he went to Russia. Must have been some deal. We suspect he was an FBI informant because he was meeting with all these FBI agents all the time, and they were destroying the records. We suspect he was an FBI informant because he went to an FBI informant named Lee warned the FBI of an impending assassination attempt in Chicago. We suspect he was an FBI informant for all these different reasons. But we don't need proof of it. By January 27, 1964, we finally have proof, courtesy of articles by Joe Golden on December 8 in the Philadelphia Inquirer, Lonnie Hudkins in the Houston Post on January 1st, 64. Those were the articles that were pushing the narrative that they suspected he was an FBI informant. Well, there were a lot of people who suspected it. Finally, Harold Feldman on 27th of 1964 was able to prove it. So we've already got the statement on that TV station by Marina on February 3. She's making a publicity tour now. That's what she's doing. She's gone around several different media outlets, and on February 3rd, she goes and testifies before the Warren Commission. Notice they didn't have her testify to the Warren Commission until she was ready. They primed her and she was ready. Anyway, she testifies very incriminating testimony against Lee Harvey Oswald, saying she believed Oswald was guilty of the assassination. She gave all these anecdotal pieces of evidence that got thrown into the report. So all that time and effort to prime her, and then the bringing of her to the H.O. Hunt building. There's only one reason Hunt would be involved in this. Hunt's not in the FBI. He's not an investigator. There's only one reason he'd be involved in Marina, and that is to pay her. That's what he was. He was a paymaster. And all these other cases involving uh, Chicago to pay Ruby, where'd the money come from? Hunt. Involving Memphis to pay Percy Foreman, where'd the money come from? Hunt. Involving $40,000 to pay Sirhan's lawyer, where'd the money come? Came from Hunt, according to Currington. And now we have the Marina situation. She comes to his building, and right in the aftermath, the direct aftermath of that meeting in the Hunt building, she goes out to the TV station, convicts her husband with her statements, goes to the Warren Commission, convicts her husband again. In other words, all that prep work was pretty useful. February 17th, 1964, LBJ issues an executive order creating a, quote, blue ribbon commission to, quote, investigate all aspects of the assassination, produce an official report that would, quote, satisfy the American people. He uses the exact same lingo verbatim that Nicholas Katzenbach used in his interoffice memo to the Justice Department, saying we must satisfy the American people that Oswald was guilty, that he didn't have any Confederates, and that he would have been convicted of trial law. He uses the exact same verbiage to satisfy the American people. And of course, one of the objectives is to avoid parallel investigations. In other words, we can't have Dallas investigating. We can't have the Congress investigate. We got to tie it all up in one, because that's how you contain things. And of course, the two most pivotal people that everybody thought it was the guy in charge, Earl Warren. He's just a spokesperson. He's a figurehead. His name gives credibility to this cover up. But the two most important people I've circled here, the one on the left is Gerald Ford, and he is the liaison. He is secretly informing for Hoover and the FBI, to the FBI, everything that's going on inside the Warren Commission, helping steer it. And then the guy on the right is Allen Dulles, and he is the protector for the CIA. So the two intelligence agencies most responsible, I believe, for the assassination of JFK have cover internal. They've infiltrated the very commission that's supposed to investigate it, and they're steering it. They're reporting back to their handlers, their bosses, Ford to the FBI, and Dulles to the CIA. It's a cover up from the start, and the whole mandate is to use the FBI investigation produced by Hoover and the FBI to sell the lone gunman. This is what's going to be injected into the Warren Commission, which is eventually going to become the Warren Report. They're just literally going to launder the FBI report through the Warren Commission to eventually become the Warren Report. And of course, they're going to begin with the conclusion that Oswald is the lone gunman. They're going to work backwards towards a predetermined outcome, excluding all the exculpatory evidence, including all the incriminating evidence, and even altering evidence, destroying evidence, suppressing evidence. I mean, all the things that can be done with evidence to make sure that the narrative going in was the same narrative coming out. Here's some more evidence of suppression. March 1964, James Leon Simmons, who was a car inspector for Union Terminal Railroad right there in Dealey Plaza. He had been standing on the Elm Street overpass with co-workers and two Dallas policemen during the motorcade. He was interviewed on March 1964 by Mark Lane. Now, he had given his testimony already to Dallas Police, FBI, Warren Commission. Mark Lane got a hold of him and says, "What did you tell him?" He says, "What did you see and what did you hear?" Simmons says, quote, "The presidential limousine was rounding the curve on Elm Street. There was a loud explosion. At the time, I didn't know what it was, but it sounded like a loud firecracker or a gunshot. It sounded like it came from the left towards the wooden fence. And there was a puff of smoke, I've heard that before, that came out from underneath the trees on the embankment." Lane said, "Where was the puff of smoke?" Simmons said, "It was in relation to the wooden fence, directly in front of the wooden fence." Lane said, "After you heard the shot, saw the smoke, what did you do?" Simmons said, "I was talking with Patrolman Foster, Dallas Police, At the time, we heard the shots. We both ran around a wooden fence, and when we got there, there was no one there, but there were footprints in the mud around the fence, and there were footprints on the wooden 2x4 railing on the fence. Lane says, were you questioned by DPD? Simmons, yes, I was. Lane, did you give your name to the Dallas police? Simmons says, yes, I did. Lane says, did you tell them what you just told me? Simmons says, yes, I did. Lane says, were you subsequently questioned by agents of the FBI? Simmons, about a month later, I was questioned by the FBI. Lane said, did you tell them what you told me and what you told Dallas police? Simmons says, yes, I did. Lane says, were you called as a witness by the Warren Commission? Simmons says, no, sir, I wasn't. This is how you suppress, again, further the narrative. They knew what he was going to say. It didn't jive with the narrative. So after he was filtered by the Dallas police and FBI, when presenting a witness list to the Warren Commission, did not include James Leon Simmons because his testimony was going to run counter to the narrative. March 31, 64. About 2 weeks later, Guy Bannister is arrested. Now remember, and I covered this in some separate episodes in my Standards Plus History Academy channel about the different handlers that Lee Harvey Oswald had, starting with George de Mohrenschildt, who later hands him off to Ruth and Michael Payne. And in between those two, when he went to New Orleans for the summer, his handler was Guy Bannister. And what you'll notice is in all three of these cases, two of the three cases, something bad happens to the handlers. George de Mohrenschildt does not have a happy end. Guy Bannister does not have a happy end. Michael and Ruth Payne do. They go on to serve more purposes for the agency going forward. They're useful going forward. But these two, George de Mohrenschildt and Guy Bannister, meet very unhappy endings. On March 31, 64, Guy Bannister gets arrested, charged with assault in New Orleans for waving his .357 Magnum at teenagers on a city bus. This is the beginning and end for old Guy Bannister. All right. We'll come back to him in about 90 days here. April 26, 64. Now we get into what happens to Jack Ruby. Because remember, Jack Ruby was the mobbed up guy that carried out the wishes of H.L. Hunt, Joe Savella, got paid handsomely for his efforts. We get to April 26 of 64, and a contract psychiatrist working for the CIA in the MK Ultra program, his name is Dr. Jolly West. Now, this particular scenario has nothing to do with Ruby yet, but it will. Claims that he has finally, now no one knows MK Ultra exists at this time. No one knows that he's working for the CIA in this capacity. This is a paper that he wrote and an interview that he gave, talking about how, as a scientist, as a doctor, as a psychiatrist, he has figured out how to implant false memories into people without their knowledge. This is unrelated to the JFK case, seemingly. This is unrelated to anything. CIA, MK Ultra. No one knows that he's actually working for the CIA in this MK Ultra program, mind control. He just makes this announcement. We have discovered how to implant false memories into people without their knowledge. And that was in April of 1956. So this is way before JFK and the assassination and any of that. No one knows about the CIA doing MK Ultra work. This is just an announcement by a psychiatrist, by a scientist, right? Fast forward about 7 years later, in October of 63, the same doctor claims to have successfully induced temporary mental derangement or insanity into people. And this is all documented. And when asked how, he says, through a combination of LSD and other drugs, hypnosis, and sleep deprivation. And this is important because this is going to lay the groundwork for what comes next. This is documented that this doctor is the guy that is making the claims to have discovered how to implant false memories without their knowledge and to induce temporary insanity into people, again, without their knowledge. And they use LSD, they use drugs, hypnosis, and sleep deprivation. And it's a form of mind control. And it started in 56 with his first announcement and continued in 63 with his second announcement. So this is the guy, Dr. Jolly West. His name is Dr. Lewis, and they nicknamed him Jolly West. Now, fast forward to 1964, and this is where Ruby comes into it. April 26, 64. Okay. This is the same doctor. Examines, it's a long story how it came to be, but you can see how he's being manipulated into this position, how he's being maneuvered by his former boss, former director of the CIA, Alan, I can't remember his name. My gosh, I've got too much floating around in my head. Let me get back to this Warren Commission picture. Alan Dulles. I'm embarrassed. I can't remember Alan Dulles' name. Alan Dulles was the one who authorized the MK Ultra program to begin with. He signed off on it. So obviously he knows it exists, and he knows that Jolly West has made these discoveries. Okay. He knows who Jolly West is, even though he's no longer CIA director. So on April 26, 1964, Dr. West examines Ruby alone in his cell. There's no witnesses, there's no video, there's no audio recordings. Everything just went black for him for several hours to be in there alone with him. And afterwards, he comes out and announces to the press that Ruby has, quote, undergone an acute psychotic break in the preceding 48 hours, where he is now positively insane, and this condition appears to be, quote, unshakable and fixed. Now, this is interesting because this is before his trial and before he testifies to the Warren Commission. And he continues on describing Ruby as a completely unhinged man who hallucinated, heard voices, and had suddenly acquired the unshakable belief that all Jews in America are being slaughtered in retaliation for him, Jack Ruby, the Jew who was responsible for all the trouble. According to West, during the interview, Ruby crawled under the table to hide from these killers he said they were trying to get him. He paints quite a picture, which is interesting. When you compare or juxtapose what he said about Ruby versus all the other doctors that examined Ruby. West continues to say, Ruby said he'd seen his own brother tortured, horribly mutilated, castrated, and burned in the streets outside the jail. And he could still hear him screaming. And he claimed that Ruby was trying to, over and over again, to commit suicide in his cell by bashing his head against the block wall. When they asked the sheriff, Bill Decker, about this, he said, no, he didn't do that. He rubbed his head on the wall enough that we had to put a little methylate antiseptic on it. That's all. But he wasn't bashing his head against the wall. We have a situation here where we have he said, she said case. Because prior to Dr. West's examination of Jack Ruby, 6 psychiatrists had examined Ruby, and they all found him competent to stand trial. So the judge was suspicious. Why all of a sudden has Ruby, this sudden change happened just when this one doctor, whom he does not know, nobody knows, is actually a mind control doctor and has bragged that he has figured out how to implant false memories into people and has to create temporary insanity. This is the same doctor that now is coming out with this doomsday scenario, this doomsday diagnosis of Ruby. And all these previous doctors said he was fine. So the judge says, I want a second opinion, another opinion, basically. So he brings another doctor in, and the doctor examines Ruby, and he says that he suspects, quote, toxic psychosis, which means the use of drugs that would explain Ruby's rapid disintegration. Although he couldn't understand how that would happen in a, quote, secure jail cell, which we all know it wasn't so secure because when Jolly West went in to meet with him, all the cameras were turned off. There was no audio recordings. There were no witnesses. It was just him and Ruby by themselves. No one suspected Dr. West, other than the judge. No one suspected Dr. West at this time because no one knew who he was working for. Nobody knew he was working for the CIA. Nobody knew he was working for MK Ultra. Nobody connected the fact that this was the doctor that figured out how to create temporary insanity in people. And this was the doctor who figured out how to insert false memories into people without their knowledge. This was the doctor now reporting that Ruby was insane. Nobody had reason to suspect anything. We're going to come back to that story in a minute. Meanwhile, I told you we'd get to some payoffs. On May 8th, 1964, LBJ appoints Hoover FBI director for life. This is what Hoover was after all the while. But he was constantly being put on a firing line by JFK and his brother Bobby, and he constantly had to resort to blackmail to keep his job. Now he doesn't, you know. And if he and LBJ are what I suspect they are, co-conspirators in the JFK assassination, they both have compromise on each other. And by necessity, they're going to both have to cover for each other, to cover for themselves. And of course, that's when LBJ famously says, I'd rather have Hoover inside the tent pissing out than outside pissing in. Hoover had developed a close relationship with LBJ. They shared information, blackmail that they had on senior politicians. Hoover had been doing that for years. Uh, uh, After the assassination, Hoover helped Johnson cover up the assassination and the Bobby Baker scandal, which was just about ready to blow up in his face. It all went away. Cartha DeLoach, who was Hoover's like number two in his hatchet man, in 91 said, quote, Mr. Hoover was anxious to retain his job and stay on as director. He knew that the best way for the FBI to operate fully to get some cooperation of the White House was for him to be cooperative with President Johnson. President Johnson, on the other hand, knew of Mr. Hoover's image in the U.S., particularly among the middle-of-the-road conservative elements, and knew it was vast. He knew of the potential strength of the FBI insofar as being of assistance to the government and specifically to the White House is concerned because of all the blackmail. As a result, it was a marriage not altogether of necessity, but it was a definite friendship caused by necessity. Necessity. I got to cover for you and you got to cover for me. So let's just move forward together. Within 60 days or 90 days of his arrest, I told you things aren't going to end well for Bannister. Hoover's former FBI protege, Bannister, dies of a coronary thrombosis, means a blood clot. And he said, well, that's natural causes. Is it? Is it? We've already learned that we're going to learn, we haven't learned it yet, we're going to learn that the CIA, as a result of the church hearings in 75, have developed all kinds of means by which they can kill somebody and make it appear that they died of natural causes. And that includes heart attacks, blood clots, all sorts of cancer. And we don't find out about that till 75. But in 64, it appears to be natural causes. Interesting what happens within hours of his death. According to Bannister's widow, the FBI showed up en masse with all these agents, and they carted away all his locked file cabinets. I'll let you draw your own conclusions. All right, back to the Jolly West story. So June 7th, 64, Allen Dulles, who is basically running the Warren Commission, knows that his doctor, his MK Ultra doctor, has worked his magic with Ruby. So now it's safe for the Warren Commission to go interview the star witness. And this is everyone knows it's the most important witness in this case. And so no doubt Dulles was aware of and maybe even directed Jolly West to go do this, to go meet with Ruby and to perform his magic before the Warren Commission could go interview Ruby, so that when the Warren Commission shows up with Chief Justice Earl Roy and they make this big production about going down to Dallas, et cetera, Ruby is going to be a worthless witness because he's going to be insane. Remember, temporary insanity. And that's what Jolly West has reported. So after Ruby was sufficiently insane, after having met with Jolly West, who is one of Allen Dulles' MK Ultra doctors, Allen Dulles scheduled the Warren Commission to go down to Dallas and interrogate him. And of course, Ruby is out of his mind. He's saying all kinds of things to the Warren Commission. Quote, the Jewish people are being exterminated at this moment. I know I won't live to see you another time. Do I sound kind of screwy? You have to get me to Washington. They're cutting off the arms and legs of Jewish children in Albuquerque and El Paso. I mean, he's talking nonsense, which is exactly what Alan Dulles wanted, so that they could come out as they leave the interrogation on June 7th, 1964, and announce to everybody that Ruby's testimony was worthless. The reality is the integrity of the Warren Commission was compromised the minute Dr. West was allowed to set foot inside Ruby's jail cell. And no doubt that happened with the blessing, probably the order, of Alan Dulles, because he knew who he was. He could have stopped it for sure, but he didn't. Neither Dulles nor Helms, Richard Helms, the current CIA director, ever informed the Warren Commission who Dr. West was, that he worked for the CIA, that he was an MK Ultra doctor. Dr. West became just part of the ether. Nobody even seemed to care. And that's like the most important factor in this whole Jack Ruby scenario. By the time this fact was known, it was too late to re-interview him because Ruby had died of cancer in 1967. And so the whole setup worked exactly as intended. It destroyed a very valuable piece of evidence, which was Jack Ruby himself. His testimony was important. And by destroying his mind, though albeit temporarily, it worked sufficiently to prevent his testimony from ever being included in the Warren report because it was worthless. That was the whole point. That was June 7th. 2 days later, the Hoover FBI director writes a 3-page memo to the Warren Commission, General Counsel J. Lee Rankin, admitting that, quote, yes, we, talking about the FBI, did have a relationship with Mr. Ruby, and between March 11th to October 2nd, 1959, on some 8 to 9 occasions, he acted as our informant. That was after he had acted as an informant for Hoover, pipelining information about Alger Hiss to HUAC, directly to Nixon's office and the Senate. That information was coming from the FBI, going through Ruby to Richard Nixon. That put Richard Nixon on the map. That put HUAC on the map. That put Alger Hiss in jail. And then here he's admitting to a second time in 1959, when on 8 to 9 occasions, Ruby again acted as our informant. This was no doubt during the McClellan hearings, this is how they knew about his ties to the Chicago mob. That's that memo I showed you earlier, where they admitted he received a big cash payment from Al Dorfman. This is him during the McClellan hearings acting as an informant on 8 to 9. So Ruby is not an informant for the FBI one time for one particular series of events or sequence. He's a FBI informant, according to Hoover, at least twice. And this didn't get revealed, obviously, till much later. Of course, the Warren Commission knows because J. Edgar Hoover has admitted it in this memo to J. Lee Rankin. So at the very least, the Warren Commission should have considered the fact that an FBI informant, a former FBI informant who on 2 occasions worked hand in glove with the FBI, is guilty of killing the alleged assassin of JFK. That should have alerted, set alarm bells off to who else he's connected to, right? But the effort by the Warren Commission was not to examine those connections to the FBI. You know, once you examine why he was acting as an informant to the FBI in the 40s, it was because he had information about Alger Hiss and communists. In the 50s, it was about information relating to the mob. So if you're the Warren Commission, you say, well, why would you have an informant to the FBI, someone about the mob, if he's not connected to the mob himself? You usually use people from the inside who have information about the organization to which they belong. They're the ones that are valuable as informants. So if he has information about the mob in the 50s, that means he's connected to the mob. And yet the Warren Commission is going to make every effort to wipe clean any of Ruby's connections to the mob. And they're going to already know that because of the work of those newspaper reporters, that Lee Harvey Oswald, too, was an FBI informant. They had an agent number and pay stubs. So here you have a murder by a FBI informant of an FBI informant. And that doesn't raise any alarm bells after the assassination of JFK. It's all wiped clean. Nobody's connected to anything. One lone nut was killed by another lone nut who's overcome with grief that Jackie's going to have to come out back and testify in Dallas about the murder of her husband. I mean, it's the biggest bunch of poppycock you've ever heard, but that's what they sold to the American people. And notwithstanding all this evidence to the contrary. Okay. That was a long one. I'm pretty tired. But we're making progress. This is the longest series I think I've ever done with respect to one topic, the FBI here. So we'll be back again later, tomorrow, probably. Until then, God bless.